The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
And welcome to our program for another week here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station. I'm Ben Ball, pastor of Broad Creek United Methodist Church, along with the Reverend Robert Cornegie, associate pastor, Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle, and Reverend Carl Zarowski from St. Peter's United Methodist Church. Hi, folks.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
All right, as we get started here today, we're coming off the wake of a tragedy in a little town in Texas called Sutherland, Texas, and the as everybody knows, there was a shooter that went into a Sunday morning service there and killed more than 24 people, and others are in critical condition in the hospital as we're recording this. And he turns out that he is a ex-Air Force who was dishonorably discharged, but still, you know all the legal details there by now, that his record of imprisonment and dishonorable discharge conviction did not show up on the records when he bought a gun. And he also had a domestic dispute and issues with his ex's in-laws who occasionally attended the church. But in any case, it's still a terrible, terrible tragedy to think that this Sunday morning hallowed ground is violated in such a manner. Michael Brown writes in The Stream, Ecclesiastes wrote that there is a time to weep and a time to laugh and a time to mourn and a time to dance. Now is a time to mourn, a time to weep. Now is a time to grieve with those who grieve and hurt with those who hurt. And now is a time to turn to the Lord and ask him to have mercy on our nation and heal our land. And the rest of the article, and I know, Robert, you know Michael, the rest of the article, very thoughtful about this. There's so many questions that arise. Questions about evil, questions about gun control, questions of everything else, but all that needs to give way to this time to mourn.
Yeah, absolutely, and because of the politics of the day, that obviously is an important reminder to bring, isn't it, in these times, because everything has become so politicized that even these tragedies do, and people start using these kind of things with agendas and other motives, and just to stop and think. I tell you, I don't know if it was yesterday or day before yesterday, the pastor and his wife,
right? They were out of town.
Yeah, and they were back, and she read a statement, and they had lost their 14-year-old daughter in this, and was murdered. And of course, the majority of the congregation, and she was saying, and we don't know if we can ever use the building again. I mean, this is a church that has basically been decimated, and so just the grief that you saw, and yet in the midst of the grief, their words were words of hope in Christ and in what life really means. And I think that's what Michael's getting at, Michael Brown, in this article.
I agree.
Is that it really isn't about the motive that the shooter had, this atrocity. It was recovering. Can God, take this horrible tragedy and do something with it that only kind of a miracle working God, a supernatural God, can do that kind of thing.
Carl, I know on Sunday morning I was with you at St. Peter's for homecoming, and as I remarked to you afterwards about how special it must have been to serve and the confirmation of your own daughter
Yes, it was.
And,
it was.
And I know now in the wake of this, when we look at this family that lost the daughter of a similar age, how striking that must be in contrast for you.
Yeah. I'm still really at a loss over this whole thing. Being a pastor, being a father of a 13-year-old. And I remember reading that the pastor of the church in Texas also commented that all of his close friends were killed as well. And, as a pastor, I have a very special relationship with the sheep in my flock. And I just keep asking myself, what would I do? How do you move forward from this time?
Yeah.
This is just horrible. Every one of these people was a child of God. Some of them had relationship with God. Some, like the shooter, did not.
Right.
But was he still precious in God's eyes? Sure, he was. And in the count of people whose lives ended that day, his life ended that day as well. And whether it turns out that he was mentally ill or whether he had some other thing, we don't know exactly why this happened. And this is the sort of thing that people are going to ask now. How could this happen? How could God allow this to happen?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, the fact is we live in a broken world, and bad things happen. There is evil in the world, and this is evil manifested at its worst.
And the Washington Post runs a opinion piece as well that's called by Russell Moore, of course, from the Southern Baptist Conventions,
Right.
And he says why church shootings don't intimidate the church. He says while millions of other Christians were singing hymns or opening their Bibles or taking communion this past Sunday, at that very moment, a gunman was opening fire. And the goal of the gunman sought to terrorize worshipers has been attempted constantly over the centuries around the world by cold, rational governments and terrorist groups, all thinking they could, by the trauma of violence, snuff out churches or at least intimidate those churches into hiding from one another. Such violent tactics always end up with the exact opposite of what the intimidators intend: a resilient church.
Yeah. It's fascinating because Sunday was the National Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church. We celebrated it. We recognized it in our church. In fact, we had one of our members is also a missionary with a organization that works with in the Middle East to the Muslim world, and he had just returned from Lebanon, where he had been in the refugee camps of the Syrians who have escaped into Lebanon. And they're primarily, they're both Muslims and Christians. It's a long story. I won't go into it. But we had, that morning, right when this was basically taking place, we were talking about the incidents of persecution all around the world. And a while back, and I've mentioned it, we had a Nigerian pastor come in and talk about the persecution, Boko Haram, and all that goes on there. And he said, we have a theology of suffering that the American church doesn't know anything about. Well, we're starting to get a sense of that, aren't we? We're starting to get a bit of a taste of that, and it's my prayer is that this will have that strengthening effect rather than turning to fear. We will turn to faith. We'll turn to understanding that out of death, new life comes. It's the seed planting. That out of that horrible experience, we can have hope and we can look forward. And those are words right now for those that are grieving. I don't know that this is the time to talk to them about that. This is more, we talk about it often, that ministry of presence,
right?
Where we're there, we just be there.
And we're going to have to be there for the people in our churches as well, because we view this from a pastor's perspective.
Right.
Okay. And I know that afternoon someone in my church had posted on Facebook about what a wonderful service we had that day and how the Spirit was there and everything was beautiful. It's wonderful to see all these people. And there was one person they saw that they didn't know. And it kind of crossed through their mind. What if that was somebody who's here to try to harm me or my family or somebody else here? And of course it wasn't. But then this individual got home and turned on the news and saw that her worst fears had been realized in this church in Texas.
Yeah, and
so what is it? Yeah. What is it that our parishioners are going through right now?
And isn't that interesting that you would have, even if it's just one person that would think that this stranger in our midst, instead of being, wow, maybe they're here and they're going to hear the word of Christ and they're going to accept him as their Savior.
Right.
And
well, now let me say,
instead maybe thinking, is this person going to harm me?
Sure. And let me say, in defense of this individual who had these thoughts, their thoughts did go in that direction in this post. They said, and then I thought, don't think like that. This is a child of God. They're here to hear the gospel. Praise God, they're here.
Yeah. And that is why churches will not be intimidated.
Exactly.
Amen.
That's the point of the article.
Amen. Because hope trumps fear.
More to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the talk station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball along with Reverend Robert Cornegy and Reverend Carl Zarowski. And we want to take a look at some other articles. Faith in the News now. And one is out of, this is out of the Washington Post. And it's written by Ryan Nicholas Danker, who is a professor at Wesleyan Theological Seminary. And it talks about how the headline is, "A historic church will remove plaques honoring George Washington and Robert E. Lee, but it shouldn't." The plaques on the walls of Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, commemorate famous Americans who at one time called the Episcopal parish their own, George Washington and Robert E. Lee. As a church historian, I believe the vestry's recent decision to remove the memorials, as well as their forebears' decision to put them up in the first place, disregards the true purpose of Christians' commemoration of the dead. From the very start of the Christian faith, believers have remembered the great cloud of witnesses who came before them. During the 3rd century, the church in North Africa regularly commemorated early martyrs on the anniversary of the death, origin of Saints' Day. And we just passed All Saints' Day. So this is something that's a lot of churches have just spent their time honoring people who have just passed away or people who have been, that they stood on their shoulders and help form their churches. So this is pretty common. I know our church doesn't put up plaques for individual people. We do have, I take it back, we do have one, a dedication plaque on a building. But in general, don't do that. But this one is a historic church in Alexandria, Virginia, where George Washington, Robert E. Lee, and many others went to. But now, Robert, the attitude is they got to come down. These guys were slaveholders.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line, they committed such evil atrocities that they must not be honored any longer as father of our country.
Well, this is a little snarky, but, we're in trouble, folks. Because if the only people that we can recognize are the perfect ones.
Well, at least we have Jesus, right?
Don't take Jesus out of the church.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only one that really deserves to be there. And, but at the same time, look, do you think Washington and Lee would want these plaques up in the church? If they had known this was going to happen? I mean, this happened 100 years or more after they were long gone. Would they have wanted to have a plaque up there honoring them? Probably not, knowing the character of these two men. And so Look, I think really what's going on is there's an effort to kind of erase the American founding traditions.
Right.
And so this is part of that effort. There's a little bigger agenda going on right here. I mean, they may not admit it, but that's actually what's going on. And so we just have to, I believe the plaques, like the author said, that they really shouldn't be taking them down, because this is real history. This is real stuff. Mm-hmm. Truth corresponds to reality. And these guys were real people. And they did remarkable things for the country, and they were not perfect. I mean, look at David, King David from history. I mean, it's, we got some, and that's one of the fascinating things about Christianity, that it's a transformational religion.
That's right.
But and also a transparent one. I mean, our flaws are out in the open.
I mean, if we believe the Scripture is inspired by God, and one of the reasons we believe that is because all the flaws in the characters are exposed, and it's actually those very flaws that are the mechanism by which God transforms us. When we come to grips, as you said, your epiphany one day when you realized how sinful you really were and the effect that had on your relationship with God, not just the horizontal relationships of the people around you, but the effect in your relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And God uses that. He takes imperfect things and transforms them. Hallelujah for that.
Mm-hmm. I think the argument that this author makes here is twofold. One is that for the ones who put this up about 100 years or so into the country's history or so, or beyond that, and because you have those Robert E. Lee in there too. So, is that you have they're making that they're historical. They were Episcopalians they were fervent Episcopalians who attended this church, and because they did things outside the church that were noteworthy, they put up the plaque to them. But it's interesting, he makes the argument really more for Robert E. Lee's plaque staying there than he does for George Washington's.
That's true.
Just in the fact that Robert E. Lee, in his faith, sought to a national idea of reconciliation following the Civil War. He didn't just go and hide off someplace. He worked towards reconciliation of the North and South. And but on the other hand, this really is about the plaques are there. Why should they come down? I can't really make the argument for it.
Well, this article is kind of part of an evolving story, because when this first was reported, the very first article I saw on it only focused on the fact that this church wanted to take down a plaque commemorating George Washington. It did not mention Robert E. Lee, but it did mention that there were people in the church who no longer felt safe there because of this plaque commemorating George Washington.
Really?
Plaque might fall on them.
Right. And so it was a couple days later I saw an article where it said, okay, there's this one plaque about Washington and another one about Robert E. Lee. And in the news of the last 6 months or so with
Charlottesville and everything else.
Right. Then all of a sudden I said, okay, now it makes a little more sense. If you bring Robert E. Lee, that seems to be a very hot button item right now. Okay. But as Ben said at the beginning here, you don't put up plaques in your church. We don't put them up in our church. We're not there to worship any individuals. We're there to worship God. Okay. Now, do I think it is historically significant that the two of these people worship there? Oh, yes, I do. I love to know that I share a faith with our founding fathers. I love that. Okay. And the story of how Christ transformed Robert E. Lee into looking at issues one way, and then he said, you know what? We need to do something different. Okay. that, as you said, that's the transformative power of the gospel. God changes things. God changes people.
And the other part of this, though, is that churches, we need to still recognize, as certainly our people who've gone before us have, that churches are part of our history. And so, as a historic element, this is. I mean, I lived in Williamsburg, and the Anglican Church in Williamsburg, where Washington sat, I've sat in his pew.
So is this more a question of covering up this part of history, or is it a question of trying to take the church out of the history?
Mm-hmm.
See, I think it's both there too, and that where you may have had a theological argument to not put them up in the first place. To take them down now, there's a historical argument about not doing that, because it is part of our history, for good or for bad, wherever you want to argue about all the other things that go along with it.
Well, yeah, and I think from a theological point of view, there's a very good reason to put it up there. It's like King David. King David is recognized as one, obviously as a historic figure in the formation of Israel. They don't pretend that
he didn't exist.
because he had an affair. So we have to. The part of this also is this kind of politically correct thing that we're finding is it really debilitates reality.
Right.
It changes reality, and so how can something be correct historically, theologically, and not be correct politically, and you would choose the political incorrectness over the historical theological correctness?
But now, from a theological point of view, I can see taking these plaques and moving them out of the worship space into the narthex or on the outside of the building or somewhere in the building, saying, this is the church that George Washington worshiped. This is where Robert E. Lee worshiped. Okay, you can even put more information on the plaque there if you want. Okay, but I can see that in a worship space, do we want to be drawing attention to individuals, or do we want to be drawing attention to Jesus?
But then you also are dishonoring the people who went before you, who put them up there in the first place.
I understand
too.
that.
And you go around, and I can go around and look at a lot of churches where they have where the stained glass was dedicated to an individual.
And see, that's why we don't.
I know, but I'm not advocating that they take them out.
No, and I think it's important. Every person sitting in a pew is going through the same battle that George Washington theologically and Robert E. Lee went through. See, we do need those reminders. We're not worshiping them for their perfection like we do Christ.
Right.
We're worshiping Christ because he transformed these men. And so there is a theological context to this that we don't want to see taken away, that it's just some historical fact that took place.
Isn't it interesting? Remember the article we had about the church in St. Petersburg in Russia? That was the people who lived there didn't want it taken over by the Christians,
right? Because
of the historic value, of the church. Whereas the real remnant of the Christians wanted to still worship there.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was being challenged. I think that's an interesting contrast, and I hate to see us heading in that direction as well.
Well, I think this is part of the area where the church has to stand ground on, because it is so significant that we're losing a part of our heritage.
More to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Thanks for joining us here today. And I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Carl Zarowski and Reverend Robert Cornegie. We want to talk a little bit about a story that's a little bit unusual, but it has made a splash, certainly across evangelical circles and church circles, but it also made it into some main newspapers as well, too. This one actually comes from the Lynchburg newspaper, the News in Advance. It said, ticketed concert guest, evangelical pastor and author Jonathan Martin removed from concert at Liberty University. Jonathan Martin, an evangelical pastor and author, claims he was removed from Liberty University on Monday night following a pop concert and threatened with arrest should he return to campus. A citation signed at 10:05 p.m. by an LU officer Images of which later posted on social media by Martin showed that he was removed by request, but does not make it clear who requests his removal from campus. On down, it talks about how he's recently caught the attention of Liberty students and campus officials when he spoke against the LU president Jerry Falwell Jr.'s support for President Donald Trump's administration. He criticized Falwell on Twitter after Falwell gave an interview to Breitbart, and et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is he's just exercising his freedom of speech, right? And he's attending the concert, but apparently he had also posted that he wanted to have people who support him gather on the campus for prayer and for other things and whatever else, but that they were on campus doing that. But Liberty University is a private school, and so therefore it's private property. Should church-run universities that are private property do such things like this? Robert, what do you think?
The temptation really is to kind of conflate this with what's been going on at Berkeley and other campuses.
Free speech things.
These free speech issues, and that speakers who have been invited in to do a presentation by an official recognized church campus organization like the Young Republicans or something like that. And then they have this, I like your word, kerfuffle.
Kerfuffle here,
over this. And so we want to say, oh, well, here we go. Here it is again. Well, it's not. This is apples and oranges. It's a different thing entirely. And a public, this person is just initiating, this Martin guy or Reverend Martin, is initiating this as a protest because he's been quite vocal about how offended he is by President Falwell about his support of Trump. And so this all goes back to here we go again with the political correctness. And so, the campus has had a policy that if you're going to do something on campus, you've got to go through the administration to do it.
Right.
If you're going to do a demonstration or you're going to do something, you've got to get proper permissions, and he wasn't going to do this. So it's a publicity stunt, frankly,
for this guy.
That's now, what he said.
Like he said, he was there for the music. He was visiting the band backstage or something when he was asked to leave. But he had actually planned to have other events.
Exactly, and invited other people. To come. As well as Liberty students, and I'm sure
the public was
there one or two liberal Liberty students.
Yeah, the public was invited to the concert. It wasn't just for the students. But so Carl, where do you fall down on this as well too? And we got to think our churches are. What do we say about that? Our churches are private property.
Well, let's say that somebody came to your church with the intention to disrupt. Would you ask them to leave?
Yes.
Sure. Sure. And so I understand this, with this being private property. This other article that you gave us from Religion News Services.
Yeah, this is President Jerry Falwell Jr.'s response to this.
Right. And I love what he says. He says, of everything published about this tempest, the best observation came from my wife. What if someone you had never met announced on social media they were going to come into your living room, invite others, and have a prayer meeting after stating publicly that your home is the most hostile environment to the gospel in the U.S.? Wouldn't you call the police and have this stranger removed from your home? The answer is obviously yes, you would.
Now, Liberty University says that they have a long-standing tradition of not allowing uninvited demonstrations or protests on campus. Now, he doesn't go into it much, but they also have invited people who are in obvious disagreement with them.
Oh, yeah.
Onto campus. They had Bernie Sanders there, who actually gave a pretty well-received speech.
Yeah, exactly. So So this guy was trying to go
Sideways.
around the proper protocol. There are protocols for this.
It's like somebody sneaking into a theater, into a movie theater.
That's right. If you get caught,
Yeah.
you're going to be asked to leave. And so he did it for this very reason that he got us to talk about it today.
Right.
So that's the what do they say that it doesn't matter what kind of publicity, bad publicity, it's just publicity. Get it out there. So he has learned that quite well. But so I think the obviously Liberty University was well within its security rights to do this, and it was actually the security director that it says later in the article was the one that initiated this removal.
And
that may have been at the request of someone higher.
Yeah.
But
And Reverend Falwell does say Mr. Martin's planned protest in front of the library ended up attracting 13 students who, as members of the university community, were permitted to hold a small event. Mr. Martin did not threaten violence, and we do not believe that he's a violent man. But if Liberty began allowing uninvited outside groups to protest on campus with open invitations on social media, the next group might be a violent mob of anarchists.
yeah, and this is a different. It's easy, for us to say, well, this is related to all these other incidences that are happening on campuses. I mean, I go to the East Carolina campus weekly and have events up there. We just had one last night, but we went through the proper channels and we set it up, and everything was fine, and we had a great event. But there are rules. And we have to play by the rules. You can't just make up your own. You can have your own facts, but you just can't. They've got to fit within the framework, and so it'll be
in the effort to as Mr. Falwell does say here, in the effort for Mr. Martin to garner more attention to his cause by having his efforts stopped. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. I don't know what his cause is, other than just that he doesn't like that the president of the college supports Donald Trump. I mean, that
is his cause. Yeah, that's his cause.
Pretty shallow. I mean,
Yeah.
as far as to
right.
base a movement on.
But he's getting publicity.
Yeah.
So,
And we talked the other week about protests. What good is a protest if you're not looking for a desired outcome? What is the change that you're looking for? What is the change he wants? Does he want Jerry Falwell Jr. to denounce Donald Trump? Does he want Jerry Falwell Jr. removed from office as president of the university because of his political views? We don't know. All we know is he doesn't like his views, and he's going to make a lot of noise about it. And by going there unannounced and being arrested, or I don't know if you want to call it, he was arrested.
No,
He was just asked.
He was removed.
He was asked to leave.
Asked for it.
Okay, and probably very properly. Okay, I doubt they roughed him up or anything
they
like
took his
that. They
picture,
just
they
said,
said,
"We need you to leave. You're not welcome here." And now he's got the publicity that he wanted.
Yeah,
and I think that's his goal, is the publicity. But I'm not him. I'm not there. I only have what was shared in these articles.
yeah. Well, if I were a student or a parent of a student at Liberty, I would want to know that Liberty has we were just talking about security issues.
Yeah, right.
And that's
That
what
there
what
is-
Falwell said this is. It's all a security.
You don't know where these things go, and so are the intentions. And sometimes, you may have innocent intentions, but others get involved. And that's the sort of Antifa thing. They're talking about this so often. These protests on campuses begin with students, but then these outsiders come in.
Yeah.
And then it starts snowballing and getting out of hand. And
At the very start of the Iranian hostage crisis back in '79, I was a student at NC State, and there was a rally that started in the Brickyard. And it went from being a very organized group of students to being a big mob of angry people that took off marching down Hillsborough Street, and it all happened over a period of about 30 minutes. Was that a security issue? Sure it was. The Raleigh police were there to get people out of the street. You don't have a permit to march down the street. Was that the problem? No, the problem was it was causing a safety issue for the traffic, for the students, for everybody else, and these things can mushroom very, very quickly.
I'm curious, were they pro or anti-hostage there? I mean, what was the which way did that go?
Well, here at the time, it was interesting because the hostage crisis was only about 2 days old. Mm-hmm. And so everybody was still kind of learning the facts, and there were a lot of Iranian students at NC State.
Yeah, that's right.
And there were some people who were shouting to send all of the Iranian students home, and then there were others who were saying, but these students here had nothing to do with what was going on there. Right. So what we had was great division and a lot of fighting back and forth between the two. And then one side, and I think it was to send the Iranian students back to Iran, that side began to overpower the other side, and that was when things began to get ugly.
Yeah, again, it's all, as you said, without complete facts, and this is still here, too. This case
That's right.
is that there, as you're saying, Robert, there's no goal to this other than publicity.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's a media-driven thing. That's what it is.
Our Sign of the Apocalypse segment coming up next here on Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. Thanks for joining us here today. I'm Ben Ball along with the Reverend Carl Zarowski and Reverend Robert Cornegy as we take a look at one more article here today. This is from ChristianHeadlines.com. Planned Parenthood called out for saying black women are better off getting abortions. This is published on November the 3rd. It says a group associated with Planned Parenthood posted a couple of tweets on Tuesday, which created significant backlash. According to theblaze.com, Planned Parenthood Black Community is the name of the other group, says seem to be encouraging black women to get abortions. They tweeted, this is a screenshot of the tweet from PP Black Community, and it's their Twitter handle is at ppblackcom, C-O-M-M. Says, if you're a black woman in America, it's statistically safer to have an abortion than to carry a pregnancy to term or give birth. Robert, this is truly a sign of the apocalypse.
Oh my goodness, isn't that amazing that they're using? I mean, look, we know we shouldn't be surprised by this thing. This is the culture of death. When you abandon the culture of life as a society, when you basically choose death over life, when you choose cursing rather than blessing, that's the old Deuteronomy clause. I set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose you. And then he says, but choose life. Now, we have free will. We can choose. We can choose this kind of evil. And Planned Parenthood denies the roots of where it came from. Planned Parenthood was a eugenics movement. Eugenics was that you can go in and through manipulating genes or by selective marriage or by eliminating the flaws.
Removal of the population. Yeah,
you can modify the population to this is and of course we know that in Germany this became a modus operandi for a whole war. I mean, it started in eugenics, and Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, she actually came up with the name, is the one, and it was to depopulate the black community.
Which
it was
racist,
which she felt was inferior, and this came right out of this evolutionary movement, because they believe that we can modify evolution to perfect the species, and really that's what they were trying to do. And so to actually now try to celebrate, I mean, the majority of Planned Parenthood centers are located in impoverished areas. I mean, all you have to do is go and look at the population statistics all over the country, and you're going to find them in the impoverished, the black and brown communities primarily. And this is horrifying. This is why we should not be funding Planned Parenthood through our taxes, through our government, and we're still doing it. And it's an offense to our Lord, quite frankly, to God, that life is a gift. It's not a burden. It's not something to be despised. It's not to be punished. Yeah.
You know, we've watched pro-abortion advocates throw out a lot of statistics about the cost of raising a child and how this is contributing to the poverty in America and a number of other uses of census statistic data. And here there's an attempt to do that as well. Here it says between 1988 and 2015, 16.1 million women accessed abortion care. 108 died. By the way, in 2011 to 2013, black women accounted for 43.5 deaths of every 100,000 live births. As if somehow those are equal, and equivalent kinds of statistics. And it is interesting in here when one of the people that responded to this Twitter this tweet from the PP Black community said, if you're a black woman in America, it's statistically safer to have an abortion than to carry a pregnancy to term or birth. Is somebody we've interviewed on this program before, Abby Johnson, who worked at a Planned Parenthood clinic until she saw a live birth being extinguished. Carl, this is again to have this be a quasi-official or even just ancillary group that is promoting this idea is scary.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And you know, I keep going back to the value of a human life.
Yeah.
You know, it seems like every article we talk about, I keep coming back to that value of human life. Sanctity. Every life is sacred in God's eyes. Okay. And I do understand that childbirth is risky. I don't care what color you are, childbirth is risky. When my wife and I had our second daughter, my wife almost died during the delivery, and it was a very scary time. And you realize that that's going to be a possibility. Okay. Now, I think it's frightening too that 108 people died getting an abortion. You know, and it says here that you know, abortion is medically safe. Well, 108 women died.
And that's an acceptable statistic.
And that's an acceptable
that's not counting
statistic.
the child.
Right. And the thing is, with the abortion, you know what the procedure is, okay? With the childbirth, there's so many variables that can happen there that when I look at that and I say, okay, the statistics they're showing, there would be about 435 deaths per million. Okay, and that's a lot of people, all right? But we don't know what all the circumstances were there. And we don't know the circumstances with the ones who died during the abortions either.
Sure, yeah, and because as you said, there can be so many variables there about whether or not you have drugs involved, what kind of prenatal care there was, any number of issues that come up.
That's exactly right.
So.
And you wonder here, you know, how can they get away with promoting abortion, which is what they're doing? They're saying, do this. This is a better alternative. This is safer for you.
It's better than having the child.
Yeah, it's better than having the child, and you don't have to put yourself at risk.
Yeah. Yeah, we see, you guys, we're close to the same ages, in that you remember the population bomb book that was written back, and that we're overpopulated. I just heard the other day that one of the Prince Williams or Prince somebody said that we have we're overpopulated. I mean, they're still talking about this stuff, and people have just gotten gotten it completely flipped over. And I don't know if I've used this illustration or not before, but the most valuable resource on the planet is the human intellect, because it's from the human intellect that we're able to develop and use the resources that we have. And I often use the resource of oil. We have oil really had no intrinsic value other than you could burn it, basically. But it was the human intellect that figured out how to transform this liquid, fairly valueless liquid, into incredible resources. Think of plastics. Petroleum based. Think of, we tend to think, oh, it's fuel. But no, it's far beyond that. Where did the value come from in our resources? Sand. We got a stretch of sand over there that's seems endless. And silicone. A silicone chip, a computer. Who figured that out?
Right.
It wasn't the sand that figured it out. They didn't walk over there and it evolved into a silicone chip. It took a human being to do that. And so that's just from a pragmatic point of view. That's not talking about even the fact that God so values human life that he calls it a gift. So we have allowed this worldview, this culture of death, to invade what is a culture of life, which is the church life. We value not based on utility, just on the fact that life exists. And if you're impaired in some way, that doesn't lessen your value, the value that God places on you, that his son died for you. That's how much he values you. So that's a powerful lesson. We've got to stand against this thing.
If there's any lesson out of any of the statistics or the argument that they're making, the lesson is only that, we need to improve prenatal care, or we need to improve deliveries. We can have that discussion.
Right.
That's very different from saying, oh, you are better off not having this life involved with you. That's the message they're saying.
Yeah, the startling thing is that they don't tell you is the rest of the story and what happens to those products of conception that are aborted and that are then marketed and sold out into as a commodity.
Or what happens even to many women who feel guilty
for the rest of their lives.
Who have to deal with that.
That's right. That's exactly right.
In ways that we can't even imagine.
Yeah. As men.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, they've just revealed their hand, the corruption. Yeah.
And thanks for joining us again on Faith Matters here on the Talk Station. I want to thank again Reverend Robert Corning and Reverend Carl Zarowski. And I'm Ben Ball. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.